The first thing my sister said to me less than a day after my husband's military funeral was, "Half of that house belongs to my son." She was standing on my front porch holding a stack of documents like she had come to close a business deal. My parents were beside her. Not one of them looked ashamed, not one of them asked how I was holding up. For a second I honestly thought I had heard her wrong. Because who says something like that the morning after a funeral? Who says it after the burial of a man like Robert? And who says it to family? But Karen wasn't confused, and she definitely wasn't joking. She looked straight at me and said, "My son is Robert's child, and I can prove it." Then she lifted the papers in her hand. I looked at her, then at my mother and father. My father wouldn't meet my eyes. My mother had that tight, guarded expression she always wore when she had already chosen a side. That was when I realized this wasn't spontaneous. They knew exactly why they were there. I should probably tell you who I am. My name is Linda Parker. I'm 67 years old, and until the day before that moment, I had been married to Colonel Robert Parker for 43 years. Now I was a widow. Robert's funeral had been held at a veterans cemetery outside Raleigh, North Carolina. There were rows of white markers, an honor guard, the folding of the flag, the bugle playing taps. More people came than I expected, old Army friends, church members, neighbors, veterans Robert had mentored over the years. He wasn't famous and he wasn't rich, but he was deeply respected. To Robert, that mattered more than anything else. By the time I got home that evening, I was hollowed out. People from church had brought food, neighbors stopped in. Friends called and cried and prayed. Eventually everyone left and the house became painfully quiet. That first night without Robert, I barely slept. His glasses were still on the nightstand. His mug was in the kitchen. His boots were by the back door. Every room looked like he might walk into it at any moment, and every room reminded me that he never would again. The next morning I woke before sunrise and made coffee I didn't want. I sat at the kitchen table trying to breathe through the silence. After a while I decided to drive into town, not because I needed anything, but because staying inside that house felt unbearable. When I came back, Karen's SUV was parked in my driveway. My parents' car was behind it. The three of them were waiting on my porch. I walked up the steps slowly and asked, "What's going on?" No one offered condolences. No one mentioned Robert. Karen held out the papers. "My son is your husband's biological child." I just stared at her. Her son Dylan was 19, quiet, respectful, a good kid from everything I had ever seen. Nothing like this. Nothing like her. Karen kept going. "That means he's entitled to his share of Robert's estate." I said, "You cannot be serious." She flipped through the packet and thrust one page toward me. "DNA doesn't lie." Then she smiled. It wasn't the smile of someone in pain. It was the smile of someone who thought she had already won. My mother finally spoke. "Linda, maybe we should all sit down and talk this through calmly." Calmly. The morning after my husband was buried, my family wanted to calmly discuss who should inherit his property. I looked down at the papers, but my mind had already gone somewhere else, back 3 months, to Robert sitting in his study with a stack of folders in front of him. He had said very quietly, "If anything unusual happens after I'm gone, check the bottom drawer." At the time, I thought he meant insurance papers or pension documents. Robert was the kind of man who prepared for every storm before the clouds even showed up. I hadn't asked questions. Now those words came back with perfect clarity. The bottom drawer. I looked past Karen through the front hallway toward Robert's study. Then I did something that confused all of them. I smiled and said, "Interesting." That was it. No tears, no argument. No shouting on the porch, just one word. Then I walked past them and went inside. Behind me, Karen called my name. I ignored her. I went straight into Robert's study. The room looked exactly as he had left it, orderly, quiet, every pen in its place. For a moment I just stood there, missing him so badly I could hardly breathe. Then I opened the bottom drawer. Inside were neatly arranged folders: taxes, insurance, property records, military paperwork. And beneath all of them was a large sealed envelope with my name written across the front in Robert's handwriting. "Linda, open only if needed." I sat in his chair and stared at it for a long moment before breaking the seal. Inside was a letter, along with several folders and a business card. The letter was dated nearly 2 years earlier. I unfolded it and began to read. It started the way Robert always spoke to me, steady, practical, kind. He explained where important documents were, which accounts were where, who to contact about veterans' benefits, what I would need to know if he died before I did. Then I reached the paragraph that made my pulse jump. If Karen approaches you regarding paternity, inheritance, or any financial claim, contact attorney Michael Benton immediately. Do not argue. Do not negotiate, do not sign anything. Everything necessary has already been prepared. I read that part 3 times. Karen. Robert had named Karen specifically. I picked up the business card. Michael Benton, estate attorney. Then I opened the second folder. Inside were private investigator reports, timelines, interview notes, copies of records, photographs, financial summaries, page after page of careful documentation. Karen's name was everywhere. So was Dylan's. The deeper I read, the more stunned I became. Years earlier, Robert had quietly investigated her claim. He had done it thoroughly. According to the reports, Karen's story had changed multiple times. Dates didn't line up. Statements contradicted each other. Pieces of her account simply didn't hold together. The final summary was highlighted in yellow. Further paternity claims involving Colonel Parker are unsupported by the available evidence. Unsupported, not unresolved, not possible, unsupported. There was also a separate folder containing updated estate planning documents, trust records, revised legal instruments, notarized paperwork, everything current and airtight. Which meant one thing immediately: the will Karen had waved in my face was outdated. She either didn't know that or she hoped I didn't. A few minutes later, she appeared in the doorway of the study. "Well," she asked. "I'm reading," I said. She crossed her arms. "Do you believe me now?" I looked at her carefully. For the first time, I could see the strain under her confidence. She was impatient. Defensive, hungry for a reaction. "I haven't finished reviewing anything," I said. Her jaw tightened. "Dylan deserves what's his." That sentence stayed with me. Not once did she say Robert deserved the truth. Not once did she say Dylan deserved clarity. Only that Dylan deserved money. At least that's how she framed it. After she left the room, I called the lawyer. The receptionist answered and said something I will never forget. "Mrs. Parker, Mr. Benton asked us to expect your call someday, not if, someday." The next morning I drove to his office. Michael Benton was in his early 60s, calm and unflashy, the kind of man Robert would trust. After offering his condolences, he looked at the envelope on his desk and said, "So Karen finally made her move." That was how I learned the rest. Years ago, Karen had approached Robert privately. At first she hinted, then she suggested. Eventually she claimed outright that Dylan might be Robert's son. Robert had been stunned, but not because he believed it. He knew it wasn't true. What disturbed him was the fact that she might try to use it later, especially after his death, when he wouldn't be there to defend himself or protect me. So he handled it the way he handled everything, quietly, methodically, completely. He investigated, he documented, he updated his legal protections. He made sure that if this ever resurfaced, the truth would already be in place. I asked Benton the question that hurt the most. "Why didn't he tell me?" The attorney answered gently. "Because he knew what it would do to your family." That sounded exactly like Robert. Even in preparing for betrayal, he was trying to spare me pain. For the first time since Karen showed up at my door, I stopped feeling afraid. But Karen wasn't done. Within days, people began calling. A cousin from Virginia, a relative in Tennessee. A woman from church, a family friend I hadn't spoken to in months. The conversations all circled the same question. "Linda, is there any truth to what Karen is saying?" She had started spreading the story. And in a small town, gossip travels faster than facts ever do. At church, people were polite, but I could see the curiosity, the whispering, the doubt, sympathy from some, suspicion from others. One woman I had known for 2 decades squeezed my hand after service and said, "If you need someone to talk to," she meant well. But I could see in her eyes that she thought there might be something to the rumor. I drove home and cried harder that afternoon than I had in days, not because Karen embarrassed me, because Robert wasn't there. Normally he would have steadied me, made one dry comment, reminded me that noise has a short shelf life. But he was gone, and grief makes even a strong woman feel unprotected for a while. Then my parents came over. This time they came inside, sat at my dining table and asked why I wasn't cooperating. Cooperating with what? A lie. I asked them a simple question: "Have either of you seen real evidence?" They looked at each other. That was my answer. They had taken Karen's side not because they knew the truth, but because they had always taken Karen's side. She was the one who struggled, the one who made messes, the one everybody rushed to rescue. That pattern had existed our whole lives. For the first time, I stopped excusing it. A few days later, 3 men who had served with Robert dropped by, retired veterans, old friends. We sat on the porch drinking iced tea, and eventually one of them brought up the rumors. I braced myself. Instead, he smiled and said, "Bob always used to say truth doesn't hurry." The others nodded. That visit reminded me that gossip is loud but character lasts longer. Then came the next move. Karen filed a legal challenge against the estate. When attorney Benton called to tell me, I asked him the only question that mattered. "Should I be worried?" He said without hesitation, "No. But you should be ready." The courthouse hearing took place several weeks later. Karen arrived looking like someone attending her own victory party. My parents came with her. Seeing them walk in behind her hurt in a way I can't fully explain. Inside, the hearing began exactly how you'd expect. Karen's attorney spoke first. He presented Dylan as Robert's son and argued that he therefore had inheritance rights. He referenced fairness, biology, family, and estate access. Then Karen took the stand. And I'll give her this, she was convincing. She spoke about raising a child alone, about struggle, about years of silence, about wanting what was rightfully Dylan's. People in the courtroom listened closely. Some even looked sympathetic. Then her attorney presented the DNA report, the same report she had brought to my porch like a weapon. When it was Benton's turn, he stood up and said, "Before we discuss what this report claims, we need to discuss where it came from." Everything changed after that. The document had no reliable chain of custody, no independent verification, no admissible foundation strong enough to support what Karen said it proved. Then Benton began introducing Robert's records. Certified documents, properly preserved evidence, professional investigative reports, verified timelines, legally admissible material prepared years before Robert died. Karen's attorney objected again and again. The judge overruled again and again. Then the private investigator testified. He was steady, unemotional, precise. Exactly the kind of witness a court trusts. He laid out contradiction after contradiction in Karen's story, shifting dates, conflicting claims, statements that could not all be true. You could feel the room change. Karen's confidence didn't disappear all at once. It drained out of her piece by piece, and then I saw Dylan. He had been sitting quietly through the hearing, looking uncomfortable and confused. But at one point, when Karen stumbled over yet another contradiction, I watched the realization hit him. He understood, not all at once maybe, but enough to know that his mother had pulled him into something built on dishonesty. My heart broke for that boy. By the end of the day, the judge dismissed the case completely. No inheritance rights, no legal claim against the estate, no claim against my home, no basis for any further action. Karen sat frozen. Her attorney looked finished, my parents looked stunned, and I felt almost nothing. No triumph, no thrill, no sense of revenge, just sadness, because winning a case doesn't bring your husband back. It doesn't rebuild trust, it doesn't repair what has been broken inside a family. As people stood to leave, Dylan walked quietly toward the exit. Karen called his name, he didn't stop. That was the saddest part of the whole day. Weeks passed, the rumors began to die down, life became quiet again, not easier, just quieter. And once the legal battle ended, grief returned in full force. The lawsuit had been a distraction. Without it, I was left with the empty chair, the untouched closet, the silence at bedtime. One morning, while rereading Robert's letter for what must have been the 20th time, I noticed a line I had somehow skimmed over before. "Do not let someone else's dishonesty turn you into someone you no longer recognize." That was Robert. He believed in accountability, but he never mistook bitterness for strength. A few days later, my mother called. She cried through most of the conversation. She told me Karen's finances had fallen apart. Legal bills had swallowed what little cushion she had. People who encouraged the drama were nowhere to be found. And Dylan wasn't doing well. That was the part that stayed with me, because through all of this, Dylan had been collateral damage. 2 days later, I drove to Karen's apartment. It was small and plain, the kind of place people end up in when life has knocked them down and they're trying to begin again. She opened the door, and for the first time in months, she didn't look defiant. She looked tired, deeply tired. We sat in silence for a while before I finally asked, "Why?" She laughed once bitterly, then started crying. And slowly the real truth came out, not the legal truth, the emotional truth. She said this hadn't started with hatred, it started with envy. For years she had compared her life to mine, my marriage, my stability, my home, my finances, the life Robert and I built together. While we planned and saved and stayed steady, her life kept falling apart. The gap between us grew, and over time, so did her resentment. At first, she told herself she was doing it for Dylan. Eventually, she admitted the truth. She was doing it for herself. That confession didn't erase anything, but it was honest, and honesty was more than I'd gotten from her in a very long time. Before I left, I gave her two things. First, a counselor's card. Second, information about a community college scholarship fund that could help Dylan move forward, not money for Karen. A path for Dylan. She looked at me and asked, "Why would you do this after everything?" I told her, "Because I don't want your choices to decide what kind of person I become." That was 6 months after the funeral. Healing didn't happen all at once. It came in small steps. A lunch invitation from Karen, an awkward afternoon with my parents. A Saturday spent mending fence posts with my father, who finally said, "I should have trusted you." My mother crying in my kitchen and admitting that protecting one child had blinded her to the truth. And Dylan slowly rebuilding his own life. He used the scholarship support to enroll in community college. He worked hard. He kept his head down. One afternoon, he came by the house and thanked me, and I told him something I hope he never forgets. When adults lie, young people often believe them. That doesn't make you weak. It makes you human. Months later, our church held a ceremony honoring local veterans. That evening, we announced the Robert Parker Memorial Scholarship, created to support young adults and military families pursuing education. Karen was there, my parents were there, Dylan was there. As I stood at the podium and looked out at the room, I realized something with absolute clarity. The house was never the real inheritance. Neither was the money. Neither were the accounts or the property or the paperwork. Robert's true legacy was his character, his discipline, his foresight, his patience, his integrity, his respect for truth. Those were the things he left behind. Those were the things still shaping lives long after he was gone. Later that evening, I drove alone to the veterans' cemetery. The sun was low, spilling gold across the rows of white headstones. I brought a small bouquet, nothing fancy. Robert never cared much for fancy things. I stood by his grave for a long time. Then I smiled and said softly, "You protected me one last time." The wind moved through the trees, and somehow that felt like an answer. If there is anything this whole experience taught me, it's this: keep your affairs in order, update your estate plans, protect the people you love while you still can. Preparation is not cold. It is care in its most practical form, but I learned something else too. Money does not reveal character, it exposes it. Inheritance can pull a family together or tear it apart. The deciding factor is almost never the will itself, it's the hearts of the people waiting to read it. And if someone has betrayed you, disappointed you, or tried to build their future on your pain, remember this: the truth may take its time, but it does arrive. And when it does, you get to choose what comes next. Bitterness or wisdom, that choice is its own inheritance, and in the end, that may be the one that matters most.